Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new edition of the Sphere podcast, which is shot from my terrorist hideout in Niger, which is very convenient because Niger is where France gets most of its uranium from. And we're here to talk about nuclear things and French nuclear things, US nuclear things, nuclear energy, not nuclear war. First, an apology. We didn't have an episode of the podcast last week. We had a guest who had a scheduling issue, and try to have a backup episode, but we couldn't get one. So apologies for that. But now we have our guest today, Mark Nelson. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Pascal. I'm Mark. I'm from Oklahoma. I live in Chicago in the United States. I studied nuclear engineering at Cambridge University, and I run my own small consulting firm working on business and strategy issues in the energy sector. Most of my clients are in the nuclear sector.
Okay, very good. And so we're mostly here to talk about France because, well, let me put it this way. So, a huge plank of President Trump's agenda for this term is energy. It's one of the big things that he talks about, and a lot of the people around him are talking about nuclear. And when you're talking about nuclear and energy, you're talking about France because France is the best country in the world, and it's the best at many many things, but in particular, we got energy right, and we got it right in a big way before other nations, and we sort of kept with that. Macron tried to destroy it, sort of had to stop at the brink when people realized how well Ukraine saved French nuclear energy. We can talk about that. But I understand that you're very interested in the entire history of the French nuclear program, which I sort of know at a high level as just like somebody who lives here and sort of cares about this stuff. But I certainly don't know it in any deep detail. So why don't you tell us about the story? Because it's a fascinating one.
Will do. But before I do that, I have to correct you a little bit. France does not get most of its uranium from Niger, especially now. But they
Not
do have a
anymore. That's
number of
true.
They have a number of lovely ventures around the world, in Canada and Kazakhstan and other places. So France is fully diversified and not only dependent on a few mines in sub-Saharan Africa, or Saharan Africa, I suppose.
Okay, so yeah, no, that's true. I mean, it's this myth that France exploits the mineral resources of Africa, blah 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 blah, and it's like that's not really true. And yes, the sources are diversified, but there's like a couple big uranium mines in Niger, and it's true they don't have a lot else going on. And they are slash were owned by France, but France decided to pull out anyway. So when does the French nuclear energy program start?
Well, let me get to where the French nuclear energy program starts. But first, and this is quite important, I think, because I see a lot of anti-France slander around the world because of this Niger uranium. Niger may not have a lot going on besides like mining and minerals, but uranium is only a tiny fraction of that. So the fact that it was uranium and not, say, gold, which is much more important to the economy of Niger, that got the attention after the
That's true.
coup, it has to do with sort of, I don't know, fair or unfair. You can judge, and it's not for this podcast to get into France's reputation in Africa and the cultural importance of nuclear energy and nuclear defense were what made it a uranium story around that coup in Niger a few years ago, rather than a much more important like story about, say, gold.
Interesting.
Which gets us
Interesting.
back to why France did nuclear in the first place. I
Yeah.
promise there was a reason I brought that up. France did nuclear because a very small amount of uranium, with not very much market value, powers most of French electricity, and that it does it cleaner and cheaper than Germany. That's the
Okay.
whole point. You don't need much uranium in France. You just need a
Okay.
little sprinkle each year, and then you can power all of French society. And even then, France is using so much less nuclear than it should and could.
So hang on. So okay. So let's start there. So are you saying that French nuclear reactors use less uranium per output than others?
Well, partly. I don't know if I can absolutely say that that's an unambiguous success because it's a little bit more expensive the way the French do it. But the French reactors indeed use, uh, you know, I think some of your reactors are running on recycled uranium and recycled plutonium from
Yes, that's
spent
true.
fuel. So you have a twice through fuel cycle, which means that you
That's true.
bring in uranium, you enrich it, you put it in some of your reactors, you take the waste out, you process it, you recycle back the parts you can use, put that back in reactors, and then it will go to somewhere else afterwards. So France is able to get energy on less total uranium per unit of power output than some other places. There are pluses and minuses to doing it that way. France happens to do it that way. That is the French way of doing things at the moment.
There's always a French way of doing things. So my understanding is basically what really triggered this was the oil shock. Um, the oil gets extremely expensive. There's probably some monetary stuff. The franc was historically a more volatile currency than sterling or the Deutschmark, and so we've also had issues with our trade balance, which also affects the currency, and so the oil shock hit us really hard. um, France had been running like a full employment economy since the end of the war until the mid 70s. Um, and there were also obviously strategic risks to being dependent on foreign sources of energy. And so there was a decision. This is one of the benefits of central planning, to go nuclear, and that means when you have a strong state, when you have a competent state, when you have a state with a tradition of engineering as part of the government, where the government actively recruits the top engineers in the country to work on projects like this. It's also the time when we built the high speed trains and all that sort of stuff. We rolled these out, and so this was, I believe, the Plan Mesmer in the 70s, where we built how many?
Uh, Almost 60.
60 nuclear reactors. That's a lot.
And
Those are
can I
big.
just stop to emphasize this? You
Yeah,
had a
no.
generation of unbelievably hard dudes. Dudes who'd been through about as bad as it gets in the history of France. I mean, look, things were not amazing when Jeanne d'Arc had to like kind of kick people in the pants and get the spirit
Yeah.
up and win some battles. That was not an amazing time in France when France had been partially invaded. But the generation of young leaders who built the French nuclear system had been through a much more spectacular collapse of France
Yes.
in World War II. And they'd watched their elders, many of them heroes of the First World War, essentially be forced to roll over and give up, or not be forced and just want to give up, get rolled by Germany, and try to minimize damage, give up their own people to the German concentration camp machine. It was an absolutely humiliating time, and there were people who ran, joined the resistance, joined the overseas armies of de Gaulle, came back, fought their way back to France, and then made
True.
France great when given the opportunity in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that's really an important part of this nuclear story, that people who had seen France absolutely at her knees and had gotten a chance to be on the winning side of history, they made good on it at the point that the oil shock united decision making in France in the central planning apparatus. And there was a crucial moment here. We're jumping straight into the heart of the story, but there's this moment where the prime minister's office calls the leader,
Okay,
the
so
head of.
which prime minister was this? Do you
So this would have
remember?
been, well, under Mesmer, but it wasn't Mesmer
Okay.
himself that called the head of EDF.
Okay.
So a call comes in from the prime minister's office and basically says, we need to know, it's Saturday, 9 a.m. We need to know by midday how many reactors you can build per year. Don't tell anyone, gather the information. We're going to be working on this, but we need to know how many you can do per year. And so a few key parts of this story. The head of EDF, Marcel Boteau, he was at his desk at 9 a.m. because that's just where he was working
Right.
to build France. Okay, I'm not saying that
Right.
everyone has to work on Saturdays. I'm just saying there's a generation of dudes who, as teenagers and young men, escaped Nazi occupation to join uh, military overseas that reconquered Europe and liberated France, right? And then they were elevated to positions of high responsibility. And when the call came that you're needed, France needs you, they were ready, they were waiting, and then they executed. By the way, the answer came back too small for the government, and they said no, more. And so in the end, the goal was to start about 6 reactors per year and try to complete 6 reactors per year after about 5 or 6 years beyond the first decision.
Okay. So that was the first decision,
Well,
or did
so
they
France
go
already
bigger?
had a nuclear energy program. Even more, France had already decided to go with American technology due to its superior engineering and economic characteristics at the time. In other
Right.
words,
They actually licensed a design from Westinghouse. Is that correct?
which in my opinion, and I know that stuff like this really raises defensiveness in French folks I've talked to. Westinghouse was never able to build or to see its product be built in such a superior manner as the way the French did in
Interesting.
terms of cost and schedule. In other words, it wasn't Westinghouse alone. It wasn't France alone. It was the combination of the right system, the difficult, politically and in terms of pride reasons, very difficult decision to license American technology rather than the homegrown French gas graphite technology.
Okay.
Then there was a
Okay.
risky decision made when the prices that they were trying to get good prices on boiling water reactors from the General Electric and their combines in Europe. They couldn't get a good enough price, so they went all in on Westinghouse right as the order came in during this oil crisis. Release the hounds. How many can you build? Build that number. Don't say anything. We're going to announce it officially in about 5 or 6 months. So, in the popular anti nuclear telling of this time, it was EDF out of control, forcing the government to let them
So
build a bunch of expensive
just
reactors.
so EDF is at the time
Electricity
the
defined.
national utility,
Yeah,
because
which
back
was a
then there's
national.
one utility which is a national monopoly and is owned by the government. So
Well, it was
that's
certainly a
the
national monopoly then. It's
yes.
not. It's in a weird way a monopoly without getting monopoly benefits for the people of France. So it's like
Right. Right
big
now
enough
we
to
have
be.
a completely screwed up system that was designed by the Germans to destroy the French energy industry. But
I'll
that's
let you say those motivations, but it's suboptimal. But it's being. But look, at this point, I think we're out of excuses for the French because at the moment, French people have French fate in their hands and need to make
yes.
French decisions and French actions to
Yes.
execute
Yes.
the French century.
Yes.
So no matter how much we can try to blame it on Germany, we know that Germany did not do that to France in recent decades, did not hurt French policy at the tip of a spear. There had to be French people that went along with German plans and wanted what the Germans wanted
Yes.
for France. So putting that
Yeah, yeah,
aside, I
yeah.
can get a little heated because of how angry it makes me.
Yeah, no, like, we'll talk about the situation today, but
At the time,
as
six
it so
reactors,
let
Westinghouse
yeah,
design, French plant engineering. In other words,
yes,
the inside, the metal piping, the metal parts, the rough
right,
layout of the plant. But
right,
it was French architect
right,
engineers working hard to implement this in a way that worked in France in French conditions.
right. So okay, so the best design in the market at the time was American, but it was the French who managed to build it uh better than the Americans apparently, and sort of more efficiently and at a higher scale.
So in
essentially,
this
is what
case,
you're
when we
saying.
say better, I think probably best to just say better means they did it over and over
Right,
in a cost-effective manner, and
right.
they've been operated safely and securely for 40 years.
Yes. More than 40 years now, 50.
Well, the problem
Depends when
is
you count,
you
because
tore
they
down
rolled it
your
out.
oldest ones before the Ukraine invasion, so you could prove to the anti-nuclear part of your elite that you were serious about destroying yourselves. But then
Yes.
the invasion happened, gas prices went up, and somehow the this drive to just destroy what's best about French industry and energy, it was dampened a little bit, and
Yeah.
may it never come back.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, okay, so but it's interesting to talk about the history because if you think about how you make something happen, so you had a kind of magic moment where you had the combination of sort of external factors that created this like need and drive.
The
Um,
oil embargo, the
yes,
rapid escalation in the cost of foreign oil,
political will, right? The
political
prime
will.
minister is calling you on a Saturday and saying, I need the plans 2 hours from now or whatever.
I need the numbers. How many can you
I
build per
need the
year? And I
numbers.
need it in 3
Yes,
hours.
yes, and you come back with the numbers and says more. Um, so you have these exogenous. I was looking for that word. You have this exogenous shock. You have political will, you have technology, and you
And you
have the
have the
right people.
technology because of, in my opinion, fairly enlightened and open debate and discussion among the elites of French engineering. So
Right,
the story goes in France that there was this industrial military alliance that wanted the French system and the utility that wanted the Westinghouse system. According to the biography of the memoirs of Marcel Boutou, who's probably in my top one, two, or three heroes in energy ever in any time in history. He was the head of EDF when all this went down. The way Marcel Boutou calls it, he says that there were people in EDF, the utility, that were for the gas graphite program and ones that were for the Westinghouse program, and there were people in the ministries and the atomic energy commissariat that wanted the Westinghouse design and others that wanted
right,
the gas graphite. He says it's not so clean a history as there was the de Gaulle, France is great, French technology, gas graphite people, and then there was the purely commercial, egghead, economist engineers who wanted to make cheap electricity. He says it's not so simple, and that it truly was a large and interesting and open discussion, at least among the elites, on
good,
which system to go to. And as the decision was sort of coming to a head, there were problems in the gas graphite system that removed any doubt that that was probably the right decision to
right,
go with
right,
Westinghouse. That was a small meltdown in one of the leading gas graphite reactors. Wait. They cleaned it up. They learned from it.
right,
They put the
right,
reactor back in service. So I'm not, that itself is a fascinating story, but it made it clear that the decision to go in the more commercial, more international, more economic direction
got it.
was
So,
probably going to be the better decision.
can you explain, just because I'm curious about this, can you explain like the technology trade-off between gas graphite and what's the other one?
The pressurized water reactor,
Right,
PWR, the classic
right, yes,
submarine reactor, and
yes,
France had already developed their own prototype of this type of reactor, and there were
right,
elements.
because we eventually made submarine nuclear reactors, which very few countries can do.
Yeah, you were already working
And
on
that
that at
and
the time.
that's a homegrown, um, technology. So, okay,
So I can
so
explain the difference, though.
you're an engineer, right? You're an engineer by training. Okay, so PWR, pressurized water. Okay, I'm sort of going through my head and looking at what I read in like middle school, because of course you learn about the French nuclear reactors in middle school when you're
And
French.
keep
Uh,
that, by the way. I'm going to come back and I'm going to interview you on your own podcast about what your education was like in nuclear in France, because I need to know that, and I think people need to hear it.
So the drawing from school that I remember is you have a bed of like uranium or plutonium rods, and they heat up uh water, I guess, and then you have another there's a separation, and then you have another layer of water, and so that other layer of water is not radioactive, and you sort of pressurize it, and it comes out as steam, and that's what spins out the turbine, and that's what gives you electricity.
Not
Okay,
bad. This
not
not bad
bad.
at all. So yeah, basically you have water under very high pressure getting heated up in the reactor core.
Yes.
That water flows in a loop in and out of the reactor vessel. In that loop, it comes into contact with metal separation walls, and other water, also at high heat and pressure, gets boiled into steam.
Right.
That water and that steam circulate through a turbine, but they don't actually mix physically
Yes.
with the water going back in through the
Right.
core.
Right. That's the important thing for people to understand, which is that the water that spins the thing is not radioactive. So the all the stuff that's radioactive is sort of contained in its own like box. And most, you know, apart from that, there's no radioactivity, right? It's not
Having
we're not
said that, you can
firing,
get
radioactive water at like at and it's the same. So if you drive around France, you will not infrequently see a nuclear power plant of the side of the road, right? And if you see the steam, and sometimes, well, no, not adults, because hopefully they know this, but you know I recall several times when a dad has to explain to his kid, no, 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 that steam is not radioactive. It's coolant, and it's completely different from the water that's inside the reactor.
now.
Um,
Let me just without hopefully getting too nerdy. Even if it was a boiling water reactor type, so not the type that France used, but one that France was interested in, but the price wasn't as good as the Westinghouse reactor. So in the boiling water reactor, your water is boiled right there next to the fuel rods. It turns into steam, and then that goes to a turbine. What this means is very slight irradiation of the system, but that's still not the stuff that comes out of the cooling tower.
right,
That's yet another loop.
right,
So
right,
there's separation after separation, and
right.
although maybe there are issues with nuclear that we should talk about, the water getting radioactive is not going to be one of them. But definitely, I appreciated hearing that because I treat you as a product of the French education system. And it's interesting always for me to hear how the world's greatest nuclear nation is talking about its greatest energy asset. Because I have a
Not
feeling
enough,
that
not
one of the
enough.
things that's
But
gone very wrong in France is that anti nuclear ideology was infused entirely throughout the education system. And
that's
back when I
totally
got into
true.
nuclear, it was not unusual for me to meet elite French students, maybe studying abroad at Berkeley or MIT or maybe going to Cambridge, who had studied at the Grand École, the engineering
Yeah,
école,
yeah, yeah.
ENPC or Paris Mines or École Polytechnique, and I would meet them, and they would claim nearly total ignorance of nuclear at first. So as a way to try to
Really?
change the subject from an uncomfortable topic, when I
Oh
pressed
man.
and I said, and when I would say, "Do you know that France has nuclear?" They would say, "Oh, of course, we know that France has nuclear." I said, "Well, do you think it's good or bad?" And it's always interesting because they didn't, at least 10 years ago, there wasn't an assumption about the motivations of that line of questioning. You wouldn't have really talked about it, so you don't know whether your American interrogator is he pro nuclear, is he anti nuclear, is it good for France or bad for France? For me to say I do like it, I don't like it. I think that was one of the reasons I got a very similar answer from all these French students in the many years of running this little social experiment. They would say, well, we do have nuclear, but that's because we had to use it. So this is a reference to the Mesmer plan and what we've just talked about,
Interesting.
that fateful moment where the oil got expensive and France went hardcore into nuclear, right? So there's a reference to that all these French students would tell me. Oh, we had to go into nuclear, but fortunately now we have ecological energy, so we'll be able to replace it. That was a standard answer I got Around the world, whenever I encountered elite French students had gotten the very best exam results out of
Yeah,
prepa,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
They had
yeah.
gone to the finest, rigidly
They've gone rogue.
hierarchically ranked university system in the world. They'd gone to these and they'd come out saying France had to get nuclear because it was essential in the past, but now we have ecological energy. That is the line that a
That is
whole generation of French
crazy. That
millennials.
engineering students, not
Yes.
Sciences Po.
Yes.
Oh man, because the engineering students I know are not like that, but I don't know that gentleman.
Can I push on
I
this and leave
believe
it a
you.
little more painful?
Yeah,
At the start of my career in 2017 and 18, we did trips to France to learn like why France was trying to shut down so many of its nuclear reactors.
yeah,
And we occasionally would meet young engineers who had been hired out of the elite universities into electricity de France. One memorable conversation, this lady engineer admitted that she tried to keep secret at EDF that she liked nuclear energy because she was worried about it hurting her career that she liked nuclear power. And that she said that she didn't know of any other of her intake of like elite engineering students into the national utility. She didn't know any of the other ones that were excited or interested in a career in nuclear. See, this is bad. This is really
yeah,
bad because
yeah,
it was 95% of EDF Group's profits at the time and 90% of the generation.
yeah, yeah.
And then I learned later from executives, when I met executives, again, off the record, trying to understand how on earth you could have this incredible blessing and you're just destroying it, right?
Yeah.
Marcel's gift to you, to the French people, his legacy. Why were you deciding to destroy it? Yes. So this is a time period, I need to emphasize this, where from 2015 until I believe early 2024 or late 2023, it was the law in France that you would reduce your electricity from nuclear to 50% or below of your electricity mix. Because nuclear electricity started at 75, 80%, it meant that as you decrease nuclear, you're basically strongly decreasing your total supply of electricity, meaning if you get rid of a reactor, you now drop your total supply, meaning your percentage stays almost the same.
Right.
Meaning
I mean,
you would have, in order
yeah,
to adhere to this law that your assembly passed, that your government did to your people, okay? No excuses here.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
You can't blame
It
it on
was
Germany
Hollande.
or the
It
British
was
or
the
whatever.
socialist majority.
So France had a law that said from 2015 until 2025, you have that amount of time to basically sack your nuclear fleet. So this would have led to underproduction, underdevelopment of talent, lack of incentive to improve uptime to be on the level of other nations' nuclear fleets. I mean, just almost anything that reduced output at the nuclear plants was accepted as an inadvertent way to just meet the plan. How about this? You have a regulator. You have a regulator that requires the most obscene, implausible shutdowns that no other regulator in the world seems to require. Not even the Germans required. And the Germans were all the way anti nuclear, right? So not even the Germans required the extreme shutdowns and closures that your regulator claims is what's required to protect the people of France. So your regulator is implicitly saying that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, not at all famous for being easy to deal with, here in the United States, they're basically claiming that the US is at danger all the time because our regulator doesn't force our plants to close for 6 months each decade or doesn't force plants to get like billions of dollars of upgrades just to be get permission to keep running.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it was, yeah, it was Hollande, and I mean, I assume that Merkel made him do this because he was basically controlled by Angela Merkel. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I was having a conversation about this with an American uh, policymaker, and basically I had to explain to him. So the mainstream in France is pro nuclear, but our Greens are the craziest Greens in the world. They're crazier than the German Greens.
Were they
Um,
deranged more because they lost so hard? In other words,
Maybe,
my
yeah,
pet theory, and normally I don't do pet theories on podcasts. I only say for sure things. My pet theory is that they lost so hard in the industrial central hive mind planning infrastructure of the government of France. They lost so hard, and they lost at almost every single locality, meaning the localities either made their peace with nuclear, were steamrolled, which I'm not saying I like that, but the plants got built, or the localities just wanted better conditions or more money from the nuclear operator, not no nuclear. So if you were a green, you're just stuck in your philosophy lectures, your post 68 vibe. That's your world, but you lost. All you can do is take it out on France's future by miseducating the young. That's my theory.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No,
then
it's
when that education ripened, in other words, when the children of 68 became the professors of 78 and 88,
yeah.
and the children of 78 and
You
88.
know a lot about French history, my friend.
I'm sorry, I'm obsessed with this topic because you have the most beautiful and extraordinary nuclear fleet. You have a nuclear fleet where every time there's a global event, it re-emphasizes how
Yeah.
this should be the French century. AI, there's infinite demand for AI. Well, guess what? You have the most underproducing, underloved nuclear fleet in the world, arguably at this point. You could turn up your nuclear fleet, not just for free, you could turn it up at negative cost
Yeah.
and dominate global AI.
Yeah.
And instead, that's not what we're hearing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or climate. Oh, people care
Yeah.
about climate. Climate leadership is very important.
Geez.
Where even if you don't care about climate, if other people do, you can attract their industries because you already built an immense amount of cheap nuclear power.
Yep.
So
Yep.
instead of attracting this nuclear industry, doing whatever it takes, there ought to be a ministry for extra nuclear power. There needs to be somebody every single day they wake up and report directly to your head of state, and every day they'd say how they got more nuclear kilowatt hours produced and sold. This should be like a cabinet level position, most important position. You guys are underproducing nuclear by about 50%, 50%. And by the way, every time I run into a French nuclear person abroad, I we get into this and I realize how, I don't want to say pessimistic people have become about excellence in France. I don't know what it is. You have what it takes. You have the people, you have the technology, you've already done the hard work, which is building all the nuclear, okay? To be great, to truly lead an independent Europe led by France. And there's this refusal to accept the times have changed and that we need the excellent, high quality leadership required to achieve it. I don't know. Sorry, it's got to be you. I'm not French. I'm American, but I'm almost feeling like I'm doing the reverse of when you had French noblemen and adventurers come over and help deliver us a victory against England in the Revolutionary War, what we call the Revolutionary War. I feel like I'm paying back a tiny little bit of debt. I'm like an American Marquis de Lafayette, where I'm saying,
I mean,
you have greatness
we
at
need
hand.
you.
What can
We
I
need
do
you.
to help you be great?
We need you. Okay. Okay. I mean, I completely agree with everything you said. Um, since the war in Ukraine, Macron has made some positive noises, though. But I just want to take a sidebar. So, what lessons should American policymakers take from the history of the French nuclear program, and if the Trump administration is serious about energy dominance or whatever, and they say they are, and they give every indication that they are, and they give every indication that they believe that nuclear should be a part of it, at least. What's the what are the lessons for the US?
Well, first of all, we should mention that there's a lot of companies creating new designs for very small reactors. That's
Yeah.
cool, but there's a reason why France had already done at the moment that they got the Westinghouse design, France had already created its own functional miniature reactor. And there were people who said, "Why can't we just expand that?" And then the answer was that reactor is 1,000 times smaller than what we need to build. We should just start at the 1,000 times bigger and then expand from there, not have to do 2 generations of technology to step it up by factors of 10. So there's a lot of people in America working on fascinating new technology that's small. There's an extremely good reason why we made the reactors larger in power output in the first place, and that's radically higher efficiency of using of the fuel. So in other words, a lot of the characteristics
Got
of
it.
nuclear
Got it.
that we like come out of using a small amount of fuel. It's very difficult to compete against fossil fuels if you give up that crazy advantage where you're using a tiny fraction of the cost of the fuel in your plant compared to a fossil fuel plant. Because the fossil fuel
Got it.
plants, especially the gas turbines, they kind of got nuclear beat on capital costs.
Yes.
Even if we make a cheap reactor by making it small, easy to build, and we build a lot of them, which is yet to be demonstrated, but I'm willing to watch and even get involved in some of those efforts because I think the potential is very interesting. You're going to have issues competing on the basis of fuel, and it's going to be very difficult to make that up with other factors, if not impossible. So, having said that, I think the first lesson is there's something excellent about what France did in taking a known design that was working extremely well. It was a market segment leader in many ways, with room to improve. Adapt that design, and then here's the key thing: under a single like mind and team, administrative team. So Marcel Bouteau at the top, his team of hardcore bastards whose job it was to build so fast and so many, right? And then they made sure that their best people were assigned locally at each site. So you had many sites, nearly just one interior design. There was some experimentation and some variety in the exterior plant design. There's kind of this myth that they did it exactly the same way every time. No, there's actually really fascinating essay about this in one of my favorite books, The Nuclear Age. This is
This
the
is the
English translation of the French book about the global nuclear industry with an emphasis on France. This book has an incredible passage about how architects, the leading architects in France, were brought into sort of a college of nuclear architects to give an expression of the French soul through the design of the different buildings and the different generation of plant design.
very cool.
Yeah, so it wasn't exactly the same, but the
Right.
administration structure was the same for the fleet. In other
Right.
words, the same people were making standardized decisions
And it was the
with
same basic
extremely
design.
close contact between
Right.
the administration verticals on the construction, fleet development, operation, commercial side, and they just straight up executed.
Right.
I think that the fleet build idea that people typically now associate with little reactors, I think you can take that fleet build idea and you can use it for the technology that we know for a fact is outstanding once you get it built. And we find the absolute most experienced and best people from our previous, most recent attempts at building. We put them on a team, we get them what they need to go execute, and then we get it done. People use this word in the US at the moment, a consortium. We do need an industrial consortium coming out of the nuclear ecosystem, the electricity ecosystem, and we need the best of the best to come together to back a single design and execute it over and over.
Okay.
Now, I have to
That's
say, I
that's
am
great.
working with one of these teams. I do believe in what we're trying to do. It's a company called the Nuclear Company. And let me tell you, that vision of what France was able to achieve in the French manner with a nationalized utility and a head of state directing a head of a utility to just execute, we're not going to have that thing in America. But I argue that we can learn enough beautiful lessons from the way France did pull it off that we don't have to have those French structures. We have something different that you don't. We have an immense country,
Yes.
hundreds of millions of people, nearly unlimited demand, and we have a lot of existing nuclear plant. You had to make your nuclear plants from scratch. So there was a lot of administrative muscle that went into just taking facilities and just building nuclear, especially
Yes.
in the face of rising opposition through the program, right? We don't have to have that. We have sites and states that are already ready for this. We just need cooperation between the utilities, the federal government to help with loans, not subsidies, but to back and not necessarily even a backstop for overrun. We need to show we can execute, and then we need to actually execute. But if the federal government sees this as a strategic necessity, especially considering that the The countries that build nuclear abroad well, they're the ones that are building it at home well.
Yeah.
Okay? The countries that are not building it at home well tend to mess up overseas or not even get the deals in the first place. So we need to build a fleet of reactors. We need, at least for some fleet, both a common design and a common management structure for some subset of new American nuclear. I'm not saying that there can only be one fleet and only one manager of building at one fleet, but at least one fleet, at least a single management structure that executes together with an outstanding nuclear design and outstanding engineering and labor partners. And then we need to build where we already have nuclear plant sites ready and certified and even hooked up to the grid. They're just waiting for us to execute the one subset of the problem that France tackled in the first place.
That's a very good. That sounds great. That sounds lovely. I have one final question, and feel free to not answer it, but I have to admit I'm curious. So you say you're from Oklahoma. As far as I know, the biggest industry, or certainly one of the main industries in that state, is oil.
Yes.
How does an Oklahoma boy get into nuclear?
Oh, and my past is more filled with oil and gas than even just being located in Oklahoma. My father and uncles were in oil and gas. My grandfather, oil and gas. Um, and my education was paid for by scholarship money from oil and gas taxes. I was at a public university that got a lot of money from the oil and gas bonanza in Oklahoma. Um, my scholarship to Cambridge University, I was selected and then funded by a retiring CEO and chairman of the board of Phillips Petroleum, so one of the highest technology of the international oil and gas companies. So
Okay.
it's just oil and gas all the way down. And I'll tell you how an Oklahoma boy gets into this 10 years ago, 15 years ago, slowly. Well, how about this? Slowly, then all at once. So I had all these signs that, in hindsight, should have alerted me that I needed to get on the internet and learn about nuclear energy. We don't have a nuclear plant in the state, right? But I was a Boy Scout, and I remember flipping through these booklets on all the different merit badges a Boy Scout could earn. And I saw one on atomic energy, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. Looked at it, closed it up, didn't think about it further. As a child, I visited Los Alamos National Laboratory, and as an engineering student, I worked for a summer on engineering issues. Let's say peripheral to nuclear energy, not nuclear energy itself, at Los Alamos National Lab, and it still didn't come to me as something to look up or study. I went to the Hiroshima Memorial, and it was shocking. It was really tough to look at as an American, be there in person in Japan and think through the moral implications. That didn't cause me to suddenly get interested in nuclear power. I went to the Kiev Chernobyl Memorial Museum, and that still didn't cause me to get interested in nuclear power. I studied abroad 2 different summers in St. Petersburg, Russia, as Russia was rapidly trying to rebuild its nuclear industry. St. Petersburg is, to this day, and was at the time, powered by Chernobyl-type reactors only a few dozen miles away.
Yeah, they
I never
also
heard about that,
had a bit of
never
the
thought
same
about it.
thing when they rolled out the same design.
So
City designed by French architects, by the way.
Well, there you go. Okay, so none of that caused me to get into nuclear. It was just some YouTube video I stumbled upon accidentally from a post on now a long
That's
forgotten
great. That's
forum
great.
on the internet. I saw it. I saw this video, and within a few minutes, I realized I'd found my calling.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Okay, so final question. This is the question we ask every guest of the podcast. Recommend a book. It can be any book, fiction, nonfiction, whatever, that's not in your area of expertise.
Oh, I can definitely do that. I wish I had it on me. I'm currently reading through Egyptologist John Romer's book on the Great Pyramid,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
and it is an astonishing adventure.
Wait, are you saying they're not nuclear reactors? I thought
Yeah,
the
no, and
aliens
and
had
whatever
designed
all
them
that
to
news
be.
about some structures below it, probably we're not gonna actually, find anything. No, the truth is that humans thought up
Yeah,
and
no.
intentionally executed
Yeah.
the Great Pyramid,
No,
and they
it's
did it as a
extremely,
product of
extremely
close
impressive.
observation and experience on the previous pyramids Every 15 to 20 years, they'd been building a pyramid, right?
Yeah.
For about almost a century.
Yeah.
So they had pyramid after pyramid, they reevaluated and reprocessed what they'd learned and what they wanted to do until finally the Great Pyramid was the most perfect and the largest and the most complicated of them all. And
Yeah.
flesh and blood humans did that. They did it without slavery. They did it with almost total illiteracy. They did it without, as far as we can tell, religion as such. Like the first religious texts in Egyptian history are from uh, 2 generations after the Great Pyramid, maybe 3
Interesting.
generations
I did
later.
not
Yeah,
know that.
yeah. In the next dynasty, it's not even. So we have this situation where something so incredible was built that after the memory of how it was done is long gone, society after society, the Greeks and then Europeans eventually made up stories and fake histories about how it must have happened and who must have done it. And all of those fake histories, those just guesses, basically, they've obscured the incredible story that you can get pieces of
Interesting.
out of
Interesting.
the hard evidence that we have in that pyramid and the one just before it. Why am
That's
I saying a
fascinating.
pyramid book in a nuclear podcast?
What
Because the workforce requirement and the schedules are weirdly similar. Weirdly similar. Seriously. So, for example, the Great Pyramid would have had a workforce that was briefly larger than a mega nuclear plant, but then about the same as a mega nuclear plant for about the same time period.
that's that's really funny. So remind us of the name of the book and the author.
The Great Pyramid, John Romer.
Okay, great.
Romer. And it's such a careful book in looking at people, at our nature, at architecture, at geometry. It's a really fun adventure history book because it goes through the history of histories written about the pyramid.
Awesome. Awesome recommendation.
And
Thank you so
there's
much for
even
your
breakdowns
time.
of labor tables about year by year, how many people would you have needed, and a lot of the implications of that, including the effect on the broader farming economy of the Egyptian state during the periods of peak production of blocks and placement of blocks from the pyramid, and really fascinating geometrical illustrations of what the sort of inner logic was of building the pyramid, and then some very cool speculations, I think very well founded, on what the social function, the imagination function of such a structure was in the minds of the people who were living and dying in that era.
That's very cool. All right. Thank you very much, Mark Nelson, Radiant Energy Group. That was fascinating. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.